Can you hear me? Can you hear me if I do this? All right. Should I move up? All right, and I apologize for my back. Maybe you want to go over there. All right. So that's where the incarnation comes in. How does a nice girl like you get to a place like this? What were those nuns doing down there? Maybe this doesn't seem like an Advent story. It struck me initially as a Good Friday story. It certainly doesn't resonate with Advent as a time of shopping or a time of stress. But we're obviously talking about something deeper than that. Advent is this season where we live in expectation for God to come into the world in earnest, in the flesh, with a body that can be cared for or tortured. I think it's fitting that the anniversary of the church women's death, December 2nd, always falls during Advent. Their lives were committed to the incarnation, this breathtaking notion that God dwells not in the sky or in the tabernacle, but in this world. And in particular, in the poor person, the oppressed, the discarded. It's important to remember that Christ didn't come as a king, right? He came as a child of penniless, landless laborers who found themselves in a strange land. The church women served that God, the one who was born in a barn. So if God is safely in the tabernacle or in the rules or even in the convent, you don't end up in a crowded grave at the edge of the Cold War. But if God is in this world, in the flesh, right here, and in particular with suffering people, things might get dicey. So throughout this project, I've tried to understand Mora's life and figure out this story. I've been asking another question. Was it political or was it religious? Why was she killed? What was her motivation? Was it political or was it religious? I've been on this for like 2.5 years. So as I've gotten further in, I realized that's the wrong question. Her commitment, what drove her to El Salvador and ultimately to her death, was both. They can't be separated. That's what I think is the truly radical implication of the incarnation. The Godhead came, and the Godhead didn't arrive as a king. Jesus came as a person who was poor, who lived under occupation. This has implications. Mora, as she grew closer to God over the course of her life, and as she began to understand church in a new way during Vatican II, she accepted those implications. When the women were murdered, there was a tremendous amount of news coverage, as I've said, about the incident, and the Marianal sisters, to which she and one of the other women belonged, in particular were thrust into the spotlight as suspicious. Melinda Roper, who was the president of the order at that time, said in one of her press releases, "Our sisters were killed because they lived as the gospel of Jesus directed them to live. That gospel illuminates and touches all aspects of human life and is never separated from it. It proclaims total freedom for all persons and societies from the slavery of selfishness, hatred, and fear. This gospel judges the proud and powerful who put their trust in idols of money, power, and status. It lifts up the needy and the poor who put their trust in God and His love. To those who are blind to the message of that gospel, our sisters and countless others who daily witness to it by their lives are dangerous. They threaten political structures which promote false idols and destroy the image of God in the human person. Ida and Mora were committed to the gospel and thus gave their lives in love and for the poor. That and that alone is why they died." So the women are now emblems, right? They're almost like a calling card. Oh, you have a t-shirt with Romera's quote on it? You have like a little pin about the church women? Like, I know what kind of Catholic you are, right? You kind of hold them as a badge almost. This is how I think about things. Because I know this story, this is how I think about things, and you can surmise a couple things about me because I know this story. There's something like identification cards for a lot of people, like an affinity for Romero or a love for the Sermon on the Mount. They're a way to say, this is the kind of religion I believe in. But before they were an international incident, or a human rights violation case, or posters in a campus ministry office, they were actual people. And Mora's the person that I've studied, so I'll talk about her. Who was she? How did a nice girl like this get to a place like this? She was a first-generation American. Her parents were immigrants from Ireland. working class, grew up in Rockaway in this blue-collar Irish immigrant neighborhood. They were poor. Her father drank. They moved 12 times in the course of her childhood. They had a life that's very similar to a lot of people in the city today, right? Yeah, move before you get kicked out, get the 1 month's free, get into the next apartment. Rockaway has this interesting history because it's a beach place, and so the rents would jump up in June because the landlords wanted the summer people. The summer people weren't rich. They were like slightly more ahead Irish working class immigrants who'd come from the Bronx and Queens down to the beach, but they would rent houses. And so the year-rounders would often get kicked out in June and need to find a cheaper apartment. So she spent her childhood, in one sense, totally stable in a really stable family, in a really stable parish community, but on the other hand, constantly moving. So she knew what it was like, you know, not what it was like to be a poor Nicaraguan or a poor Salvadoran, but she knew what it was like to be a poor New Yorker. But this Rockaway thing is really important because it's this really strong, cohesive community, and it's this pre-Vatican II church that really is all-encompassing. For all the things that are maybe not attractive about it, there's a lot that's really beautiful and attractive and life-encompassing about that old pre-Vatican II ethnic neighborhood church. And then she entered the convent, so she finished high school, and she worked for a little while and just decided she wanted to be a Maryknoll sister. So she entered the convent at 19, at a time when thousands of young women were doing that. And that, again, like nothing happens outside of a context, that again is part of like a sociological context, right? Certainly she had a deep religiosity, she wanted to do something good with her life, but there also weren't many options for working class women in particular. Women in general and working class women in particular. So from her graduating high school class, like many of them entered religious orders and became sisters. And there was this interesting little bubble in nuns between the 1940s and 60s of all these women entering the convent. And she was one of them. So I've talked to a lot of the nuns who were in her entering class at Maryknoll. They're now these 83-year-old women who've led these amazing lives. And I'm like, so why did you want to become a nun? And they're like, oh, I didn't want to get married. You know, like I wasn't going to like finish high school, get married, start having kids. I don't want to marry firemen to be stuck in the neighborhood. Like, you know, I wasn't going to still be on the farm. I wanted to do something bigger and more interesting with my life. Which is maybe not the way we often think about nuns. We might think of them as running away from something or as very rigid. But these are women who entered the convent in 1950, and all these, you know, and they're Maryknoll nuns. There's like, it's a certain type of lady who does that, but they all had this, yes, I was deeply religious, I wanted to serve God. I also thought it'd be really cool to go to China. You know, there was no Peace Corps, there was no JVC. And if you were a girl from a farm in Minnesota or a blue-collar neighborhood in Brooklyn or Queens, you weren't going to Bryn Mawr, right? You weren't going to Smith. And in many cases, you weren't even going to schools in the city or public schools in the city. So it was a chance to have a bigger, more interesting, impactful life. So that means that a lot of these Maryknoll sisters were kind of badasses. Like, they were girls who knew how to work and who had a big vision of what their lives might be and were seeking adventure as much as they were seeking God.